so incompetent and so unfit that she is obviously disqualified from being President of the United States.
Donald Trump will give massive tax cuts to billionaires and the biggest corporations, exactly like he did the last time he was president.
I will end inflation. I will stop the invasion of criminals coming into our country, and I will bring back the American dream.
We are focused on the needs of the American people as opposed to a Donald Trump who spends full time looking in the mirror, focused on himself.
It's no surprise that the 2024 presidential race is one of the most polarizing elections in modern American history. But it's been closely watched by millions of people across the country. People who are wondering how this battle will turn out between a former president and a current vice president. And while Trump and Harris both have their fair share of policies on what they want to do to the country, as well as their own criticisms to each other, they are not the most looked upon figures in this election. But it's the states that they are visiting that's got people talking. 7 states that are set to decide the presidential election, no matter who's on top, with margins so close that anything could happen. From Pennsylvania from the northeast, to Georgia in the south, to Nevada in the west. There's practically a swing state on every corner in America. But there is a state in the Midwest that people say is so close and so critical that it can determine on who truly wins this election.
I'm sure you'll be watching, and we will be watching nationally. Wisconsin, such a critical state.
Donald Trump has a less than a percentage point lead in Wisconsin.
In the state of Wisconsin.
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 The polling is so narrow. We have not had a presidential election that is this narrowly contested since 2004, arguably in modern history. In each of these states, every single one, the current leader is less than 1 percentage point in front of their opponent.
This particular battleground state that Trump won with just a little over 22,000 votes in 2016, and that Biden won in an even smaller margin with just over 20,000 votes, is up for grabs yet again. And voters both old and young are getting engaged to see what happens next.
You're seeing that enthusiasm, people wanting to participate here.
Who has the advantage? What issues do voters care about the most? And could this state truly decide the election?
It is absolutely possible that as goes Wisconsin, so goes America. As goes America, so goes the world. So you got the world on your shoulders.
When people usually hear the word Wisconsin, they think of one of 2 things. They either think of the cheese because of all the dairy farms, or they think about beer because of the brewery in the state. But between the barrage of Packer fans in Green Bay and Brewers fans in Milwaukee, there's something that is hidden beneath all of that that makes the state a little more serious than people may often think about. In the political realm, Wisconsin is known as a battleground state, or a swing state. This means that a state is not really red, but also not really blue. Swing states usually have close results come election time, and Wisconsin is one of those states. You can honestly tell that the state is highly contested because of the variety of political signs around the neighborhoods. From banners as wide as the eyes can see, to little signs where you have to get really close to see what it reads. You even get to see signs from both parties sit right next to each other. This actually happens more often than you think in a battleground state like this. But the yard signs are just the tip of the iceberg of how much of a battleground this state really is. In fact, history can tell us that this has been the case for quite a while for Wisconsin. In the 2000 presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore, Gore won the state by a nail-biting margin of just 5,700 votes. Or in statistical terms, just 0.22%. This was an impressively slim gap, but it seemed as if nobody talked about it when the election went on, because this was the same election when the Florida recount happened, where the votes were so close to call that the Supreme Court had to get involved in order for a winner to be announced. But this wouldn't be the end of how close the votes were in Wisconsin, because 4 years later in the 2004 election, John Kerry won the state by 11,000 votes. And while Kerry's win was a little bigger than Gore's in the previous election, it was still a relatively small margin, both in the votes and in the statistics side of things. And as previously mentioned, Donald Trump won the state by 22,000 votes in 2016, while Biden won the state just 4 years later with just over 20,000 votes. And now that the 2024 presidential election is just days away, with polls showing both candidates with a really close margin, and with the possibility of a Senate race being close, both Democrats and Republicans are putting millions of dollars into the state than ever before, which according to data, Republicans have spent $66.7 million in ad spending, while Democrats have spent $93.9 million. Only 3 other states exceed that number, which are Georgia, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania in particular, where both parties have spent nearly $200 million. As for which issues Wisconsinites care about in the state, many of them usually say the economy, immigration, or Medicare, though abortion rights are also frequently talked about, especially with young voters, as well as inflation and the rise of prices. It's clear now that we are dealing with something that's way more huge than just some cheese-loving state. And I honestly want to know more about what people think on both sides of the political spectrum, both on the issues and the coverage that the state recently received. So I had an interview over the phone with Communications Director Steve Carlin from the Winnebago County Republican Party. And here's how that conversation went. One of the main key demographics that have really been on the news as of late, and people are really focusing are young voters and people who are voting for the first time. How much of an impact are some of these issues to them?
Well, and that's, since that's at the other end of the age spectrum, I'm a little bit off my playbook with that, but I think in that case, the cost of everything and probably abortion means more to those younger people. And the interesting thing is, everybody always talks about, oh, the youth vote, and they all get out there and they protest and they all do this stuff. November is coming! November is coming! And then in the end, they don't think it's important, or they don't vote as much as everybody thinks they will. That's just my observation.
Speaking of that, I heard that early voting in Wisconsin has have a high record turnout as of so far. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's probably true, and I think it's because more Republicans are doing it now. The Democrats have voted early for a long time, and I think, we've been encouraging our membership, or whatever you want to call it, our side or whatever, to vote early, and I think that's really the big difference. And let me give you an example that you might not remember, because it was way back when you were just a little kid, last April. April 2nd was election day. Non-partisan, like for county supervisors and mayors and city councils, and school boards and stuff. Mm-hmm. April 2nd was an election day, and we got a 6-inch snowstorm. How many people, if you just think about it, first off, the first thing is, how many people woke up and said, oh, rats, I was going to vote today, but I'm not going out in this. Then Trump came to town. Trump was in Green Bay on April 2nd. He decided to come to Green Bay, and it was announced a week ahead or whatever it was. Mm. So a bunch of people, of course, there's a lot of excitement. People get really excited about Donald Trump. So, I got to go see Donald Trump. I got to go see Donald Trump. So I have actually had, because I spent a little time in our office, just, minding the store. The doors are open, so somebody has to be there, and I'm there, but one day a week. And I've had people come in and they would complain about the election, which is, kind of a pastime of most Americans. Complain about the election, and I'd say, well, did you vote? And I had a couple guys tell me, well, I was going to, but, I went to see Donald Trump and I didn't get the vote. I went to see Trump instead. And I think, well, there you go. So I think that's the big difference is we've been telling everybody this time around, anything can happen.
Seeing how Wisconsin is one of the most key swing states, and people across the globe are watching to see how this turns out, because back in 2016, Trump won Wisconsin by a little over 22,000 votes.
Yep.
And in 2020, Biden won the state by even a less amount, which is a little over 20,000. What do you think about the amount of attention Wisconsin is getting in this election? And do you think whoever wins will have an even smaller margin of them winning?
I really don't know the question of that. I think it's very, very close here, which I think you'll hear that from everybody. I think it's pretty close. I would be very surprised if it's not very close. The one thing I think about it is when the world is watching Wisconsin, I have to tell you my first thought, or my second thought, is, oh my God, they're going to see us all sitting around with those chunks of cheese on our head. Doesn't that embarrass you? What's wrong with those people?
Yeah, I mean, if they actually went down to Wisconsin, they would see that we're not just a bunch of cheeseheads. We actually have our own sense of style.
That's exactly right. They see a Packers game and they think we all do that all the time. So that's exactly right. But I think it's just going to be very close. I have no idea which way it'll go. I don't, it's going to be close. I'm not a statistician, so I certainly can't count votes for you. I think it's going to be close, and I think you do too.
Yeah, I definitely do. So then, what is your main message, or during these final days before Election Day, what is the main message you want to get out to people?
Turnout. Go vote.
I found it interesting how Steve mentioned the snowstorm on Wisconsin's spring election, because just a few months beforehand, Iowa suffered the same fate with their GOP caucus in January. In fact, it was so bad that it became the coldest Iowa caucus in the state's history, with much of the state being below zero for days. This caused a lot of concern for voters in the area of how it would impact the results of the primary. So it's no surprise that Wisconsin, being a Midwestern state, would also have similar disadvantages in colder temperatures. But as Steve said before, people in Wisconsin are taking advantage of voting early, and it's yet another reason why the stakes in Wisconsin are so closely watched. But now that I've talked to somebody from the GOP side, I wanted to talk to somebody from the Democratic side to get their perspective on this crucial battleground state. Now, while I didn't get a response back from the people who were in charge of setting up press interviews, somebody did tell me their thoughts on the race and how early voting went for them when I visited the office of the Winnebago County Democratic Party. According to the worker, she mentioned how a polling place just a couple blocks away had a line that was so big that it went all the way out into the street, again assuring the fact that early voting in the state was huge. She then talked about the high coverage on the state as of late as Election Day grew closer, including a broadcast segment from Sky News Australia. And finally, she mentioned how young voters were getting more and more active as they believe that this election could change everything. Now, I live not too far away from a college, and I can tell you, different political school groups are going day in and day out trying to get people to vote, both from the Republican side and the Democratic side. The most recent example I can think of was when a member of the UW Oshkosh Democrats spoke at a Bernie Sanders event campaigning for Harris, saying this: "We don't know how close the gap will be. We're hoping for a landslide, but every day we work as if it's really tight." He then goes on to say how just talking about how close the state is could make a huge difference. And with polls that are constantly like this, it's no wonder that both Democrats and Republicans are campaigning hard on this state. Because even with the many differences between these two dominant parties, they can agree on one thing: this race will be close. And now all America has to do is sit back, vote, and watch the results play out. Now, again, this race is really close, so anything can happen. But at least you now know, come Election Day, why all eyes are on Wisconsin.
On Wisconsin, on Wisconsin.